Welcome to What Do Siblings Talk About?
I'm Jacob,
And I'm Veronica.
and we're siblings.
Yay.
And welcome everyone to episode 3 of What Do Siblings Talk About? And this is a very frigid, snowy episode in real life here. We have several inches of snow on the ground, which came last week and haven't gone anywhere since then. And very appropriately, I think, the topic of today's episode is a story called The Snow Queen, written by Hans Christian Andersen. Veronica, how far back does your familiarity with this story go?
Very young child, because we had some collected fairy tales that I remember reading. One of the first things I would have read. So I don't know, 7, 8 years old.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's probably
they were the real ones. It wasn't like a sanitized version. Like I have distinct memories of reading some very dark Hans Christian Andersen.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So Hans Christian Andersen was a Danish writer who lived basically right through the middle of the 1800s, which was an interesting period to be alive. You can think of him as also very contemporary to Charles Dickens, and they actually had at least a few meetings, Denmark and the UK not being very far apart. In addition to the Snow Queen, Andersen is famous for a number of other stories. Now, I haven't done the deep dive to see what he's truly the original author of, or what he's sort of spinning up like an old wives' tale into a bigger story. But other stories he wrote: The Emperor's New Clothes, The Little Mermaid, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, The Ugly Duckling, The Little Match Girl, Thumbelina. This is a pretty significant list of like the childhood canon of stories.
Yeah. Snow White.
Yep. And Disney definitely has gone to Andersen for inspiration multiple times. I was a little surprised in doing some research for this episode that some of the writers behind the movie Frozen, which is obviously a huge Disney hit more recently, claimed that it garnered some inspiration from The Snow Queen, which is a conversation we'll have, because there are some, I would say, significant variances in a lot of regards between the stories. So I want to get into that. Briefly on the author, I want to say first, I said this was an interesting time to be alive. He lived from 1805 to 1875. So basically he saw the beginning and into really the heavy action of what's called the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. So he would have seen a dramatic change in the way people lived their lives. And I think that comes through in part in this story. I think there are a couple of different themes related to where and when he lived that are very significant, but also some really fundamental, just human questions. Veronica, do you have, would you be interested in giving a quick rundown of the basic story, not including the conclusion?
Sure. So it's set up as, it's titled as like 7 stories, but it's sort of just like 7 chapters. Mm-hmm. The initial story or chapter is basically background of, and I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more, but like how evil comes into the world. So there's this mirror, a demon creates a mirror that makes you see the opposite of the truth, basically. So if you look through the mirror, look through the grass, if you show it something good, it'll appear evil. And if you show it something evil, it'll appear beautiful. The mirror gets broken and scattered all over the world, and basically like grounded to little dust and pieces. And that's kind of the setup for the whole story.
Right. So let's actually pause there for a moment because I thought the contrast between, well, first off, the entire first story or chapter here is dramatically different from the rest of the chapters and the story in general. And I wanted to talk about that. First off, this is called the Snow Queen. We're going to have protagonists introduced, and none of them appear in the first chapter. So
yeah, it's like an entirely standalone little story, and it kind of introduces the main plot device of this evil mirror that later a shard of it gets into one of the protagonists and sort of turns him evil, if you will.
Yep.
So like it's key in the sense that it introduces this main plot device, but you could almost like sum this up in a paragraph and put it at the beginning of the next chapter. But instead it's sort of a standalone story by itself, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. It could have just been this demon creature created this mirror, which shattered, and then now we're going to tell a story about how this had an impact on some people
You
in
could
the
have just
world today.
introduced this as fact. Like, there's this mirror, it's bad because of XYZ. There you go. And now we get to a little boy and a little girl who live in houses next to each other.
Right, right.
Um,
It's almost like Anderson can't help himself, or maybe doesn't want to help himself. Like, he cannot help telling a story with characters and a narrative that he's not just going to give you detail. It's like, no, I tell stories. That's how it's going to be.
there's a whole,
Every
yes, and
detail is going to have a story.
that's sort of one of the delightful things about this story is he doesn't just sort of introduce characters to move the plot along. Like, he introduces characters and then there's a whole little backstory to them. Some of it is like actually very funny. But it's, yeah, you're right. It's he's not just gonna like put something out there and not give like a little backstory to it of how this thing came to be.
Yep. Now, for anyone who's not familiar with this story, I'm going to put a link to. There are a couple of different translations to English. I found two with a little bit of internet searching, and the one I prefer is the one Veronica and I read. The English is just a little more natural, I thought, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this episode for anyone who would like to read. I'm sure you can also get an AI to read it to you if you want, and I'm sure it's uploaded somewhere on YouTube. But I may end up also recording this and uploading it either to this channel or a different one.
It's very short.
And
It's probably like 20 minutes to read through, maybe.
If I do that, I'll put a link to my read through as well. So one thing I want to mention about the first chapter, aside even from its contrast to the rest of the story, is the fact that in a way, Anderson is already tipping his hand in the first chapter to a device he's going to return to multiple times through the story, and particularly at the very beginning and very end of what I'm going to call the real story. The real story being chapters 2 through 7. But this chapter 1, or the first story, begins, now we are about to begin, and you must attend. And when we get to the end of the story, you will know more than you do now about a very wicked hobgoblin. Now, hobgoblin is a fantastical creature. This is something you would expect in who wrote The Princess and the Goblin? George MacDonald.
Yes.
Or other fairy story tales. But then immediately after, Anderson says, he was one of the worst kind. In fact, he was a real demon. And after this, the hobgoblin, who was initially introduced, is basically portrayed as a demon straight out of hell.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which Anderson seems very interested in wrapping this story also very closely together with religion that I think is just absolutely undeniable going forward. That he thinks there's a connection between these worlds, which might be something we could speculate on. The one other thing I want to say about the first chapter as opposed to the others is it's kind of fascinating in that the Snow Queen is a story about very concrete, down-to-earth, local characters and events. but I think Andersen does a really interesting thing by making the first chapter this sort of cosmic scale. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so he introduces the reader, and you're thinking at a very macro level, and then suddenly there's just this zoom down to the place where the rest of the story is going to happen, but it sort of allows that awareness to continue behind. So,
Yeah.
One of the things I thought really interesting once we get into the actual characters the story is going to be about, it's first off not the Snow Queen again, but it's a little boy and a little girl, and we learn basically the entire setup for them before we hear their names. Did that strike you, Veronica?
Yeah, it's a whole it's sort of very generic. Like it's unnamed big town, little street, houses that are almost touching each other. Yeah, and it goes into this great detail about the houses and how close they are and how they grew flowers between one and the next, and they have these window boxes and yada yada yada. But yeah, you get all this detail about where they live before you get all the way down to the end of the very long paragraph. This is little boy's name. This is little girl's name. Um, and it
Right.
is interesting because when you go through the story, they almost don't need names. Like you
Mhm.
could just read it as little boy, little girl, and it will kind of have the same effect in the story.
And
They're
in
just sort of
fact, I'm not
female
sure there's
protagonist, male protagonist.
yeah. I don't think there is actually another named character in the entire story. There are a lot of characters. They're all named or called by their description.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like you have the grandmother and the Snow Queen. There's a prince and princess. There's a reindeer. There's like an old witch woman.
crows, the hobgoblin, flowers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The robber
a
girl.
Finnish woman,
Yeah.
a Lapland woman. It's kind of fascinating. Which is not something I thought previously to this discussion. The fact that Kay and Gerda, so Kay is the little boy at the beginning, and Gerda is the little girl. They are the only named characters. I think that is significant. Um, One thing that also though popped into my head is we did an episode on the critical drinker, and one of the things you brought up is his pointing out that there's a value in archetypes, effectively,
Mm-hmm.
in that if you give a character an archetype initially, then you can do interesting things with the character. And it's almost as if Andersen is doing that. He's doing it with all of his characters. But in the case of his protagonists, Kay and Gerda, he's setting us up with the archetype and maybe in some ways allowing us to identify, or maybe even more so children hearing this story, to identify with the archetype before actually giving the names.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point.
I want to read a little bit from the first chapter because I think this is very typical of the rest of the story, where we get concrete, straightforward detail, especially both about the natural world and then about kind of the world of winter, which the Snow Queen participates in. But midway through the first page of the second chapter, we have each of the parents, unnamed, had a large window box in which they grew pot herbs and a little rose tree. There was one in each box, and they both grew splendidly. Then it occurred to the parents to put the boxes across the gutter from house to house, and they looked just like two banks of flowers. The pea vines hung down over the edges of the boxes, and the roses threw out long creepers which twined round the windows. It was almost like a green triumphal arch. The level of specific detail Andersen really likes giving in this story is kind of remarkable, and something perhaps that some of the writers I think we see in later chapters clearly took some inspiration from this story. I think also did in their own writing, but we'll get to that. Do you want to proceed maybe from there with a description of the narrative?
From like reading from there, or just to go on and summarize from there?
Just to go on and sort of summarize where the story moves on to.
Yeah. So essentially, you're introduced to Kay and Gerda here, and I think it's also interesting when you're just reading that. Like they talk about the parents set up these boxes, so like between their two kids' windows, And then the parents are never really mentioned again, and there's a grandmother who's introduced. And it's never clear to me whether there is like one grandmother between the two houses, whether each of them has a grandmother. I guess it doesn't really matter for the story. It's just sort of interesting that there's just a general grandmother in the area.
Yeah.
Um,
So to spoil the ending a little bit, well, I'm not going to say yet where Kay and Gerda end up, but right toward the end of the story, there's a statement. They went straight on to grandmother's door, up the stairs and into her room. Everything was just as they had left it, and the old clock ticked in the corner and the hands pointed to the time. I wonder if the absence of the parents, but the presence of the grandmother is part of this general concept of home as this reliable place that doesn't change, and you can always come back to it, and it's the same.
Yeah. The clock is interesting too because, well, I don't know how far we want to get into here, but just to continue summarizing the chapter. So they're hanging out with the grandmother. She's telling them this story about queen bees, and how in the winter they fly around and leave patterns on the panes of glass outside, and it's sort of very descriptive and kind of beautiful. And Kay starts asking about bringing the snow queen, the queen bee, inside. And the grandmother just sort of ignores him and moves on, and then they go to bed. And then Kay ends up having this vision of a sort of ice queen, snow queen outside his window, he sees her and then she disappears. And that's the end of it. And then the next day, Kay and Gerda are sort of hanging out, and they end up looking at a picture of birds and animals. And that is when Kay gets something in his eye and in his heart, the little shard of glass from the mirror from the first chapter.
Yeah. So I like what you said about the animals, like sort of bees in the snow and so forth. This is something we see more of later. I think we're all very familiar with anthropomorphization. So where animals are given human characteristics, that's obviously like every Disney movie. You can have animals or maybe a snowman given human characteristics. Maybe what's his name? The snowman. What's the snowman's name in Frozen? It's not Alf.
Olaf?
Olaf? Yeah. Olaf. Maybe that is actually a callback to the Snow Queen, because while you were talking there, what I thought of is Andersen doesn't just anthropomorphize animals. I'm trying to think of the right word to invent for this, but he gives animal characteristics to inanimate things.
Yeah. Well, all the flowers end up sort of becoming not people, but it's like Fantasia. All the flowers have their own kind of personhood.
Yep. You had a question about why Kay and not Gerda. Did you have any immediate thoughts on that?
Yeah,
why Kay gets hit by the shards?
Yeah, I don't know how deep you want to get into this, and I guess you sort of see later each of them has their own flaws. Like Gerda, yeah. So Kay, spoiler alert, Kay gets taken by the Snow Queen and Gerda goes to find him. And so a lot of the story is her sort of wandering around trying to find him, having sort of little adventures along the way. And because you get to, most of the story is about Gerda. And so you kind of get to see where she has little flaws in herself. Very little of the story is about Kay, because most of the time he's just gone away in the Snow Queen's palace. So it's, I guess, maybe a little harder to see what did he have some initial flaw that made him like susceptible to the Snow Queen in the way that Gerda wasn't.
I do want to pause on this point as well, just to point out, this is a story. This is an adventure story of a girl going on a rescue mission to save a boy.
Yes.
And this was written in the 1800s. So
Yeah. Well, and this
please
is
take
one of the
note.
things.
Female empowerment. If you want your daughters to grow up strong, read them this story.
Read the Snow Queen. This is one of the things. When we get into talking about Frozen, I'm surprised they didn't keep this element of the girl going off to rescue the guy, because you think that would
Right.
fit right in with sort of modern storytelling, the way we like to tell stories is sort of flipping the narrative. So yeah, it's interesting they left that out and they switched to two sisters.
Right. So let me say a little bit more about how the Snow Queen actually appears, and then let's actually jump to talking about Frozen, the movie, a little bit. So, Kay, well, first off, I mentioned that Anderson lived through the Industrial Revolution. I think that is important to this story because the portrayal we have of the changes that happen to Kay after his eye is pierced by a piece of the uh, mirror and his heart is that he loses the ability to see and appreciate beautiful natural things, and he loses his ability to be childlike,
Mm-hmm.
and he suddenly all he can do is mock sort of simple, innocent, beautiful things, and all he seems to be able to appreciate is mathematics or human constructs,
Yeah.
things humans can make, which this to me is speaking to a society that's rapidly being pushed toward sort of mechanization of everything, very similar to the kind of mood you get from Tolkien.
Mm-hmm.
Although with Tolkien, it's less. I think it's less obvious, in part because his stories are much longer. But there's this heavy contrast between the natural world and growth and prayer and relationship to God, um, as being good things and life giving, and then on the other hand, cold, frozen, mathematical, geometric
Yeah.
things of human creation. Um, and one thing that I think occurs both, we see it in chapter 1 and chapter 2, is that there's an emphasis on this idea that I think Anderson's understood really well, that the evil cannot see the good and is unable to love. The fact, I think that this is just generally a statement about modern society as well, is if there isn't something good in a person, and if they're not living their life in a way that has goodness as a part of it, it's very hard for them to see that there's goodness in the world at all, or it's impossible for them to see that. Um, and I think this is something Anderson recognized, and he's using this shattered mirror, well, the mirror in the first place, and then the shards of it, as a device to explain this and to kind of get this across in the mode of a story. Anyway, the Snow Queen is kind of a third party character, a bit of an NPC, but Kay runs off to ride sleds around the like central square with some other boys, rougher types. He doesn't want to spend time with Gerda anymore, and ends up hitching his little sled to the Snow Queen's sleigh. Now, first off, C.S. Lewis completely ripped off the Snow Queen's description for the White Witch in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Entirely.
It's
Like
yeah.
even the whole interaction when she she takes Kay and she puts him in her sledge and they sort of have a little back and forth, and it is entirely Edmund and the White Witch. Like,
Yep.
in some parts it's almost word for word. It's kind of hilarious.
There's even the part where Anderson says, after there have been some interactions and the Snow Queen kisses Kay, Anderson writes, he no longer felt the cold, which that happens to Edmund as well. So, C.S. Lewis, please announce your plagiarism before before claiming credit for good storytelling.
Right.
But no, I imagine Andersen is himself taking some ideas. But anyway, that's one thing to throw out there right away. So the Snow Queen ends up, like I said, a bit of an NPC, non-player character, where she's sort of just this force of cold and winter and darkness and biting wind, kind of all things that are enemies to life and growth and comfort and cheerfulness.
Yeah. Well, and this is really the only time you see her. Like the whole story is called The Snow Queen, and yet she really only appears in this chapter. It says very little. Basically, all she does is go and steal Kay away and put him in her palace.
Yep.
And then she leaves. Like, she did her job.
Yeah. We get a little bit more of her toward the end, where she's seen in her palace, and then she's talking about going to visit some volcanoes.
Yeah.
But yeah. All right. So let's jump from Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen to Frozen. I refreshed myself a little bit on it because it had been a while since I watched it last.
You can't let it
go. I let it go. So I think the most obvious thing is that if there's going to be a parallel between the Snow Queen and Frozen, it's going to have to be between Hans Christian Andersen's Snow Queen and Elsa. Right. Elsa's obviously, like, there is no other way to slice this cake.
Well, or between Elsa and Kay.
But isn't Elsa the protagonist of, the winter and the ice?
Well,
she's the holder of powers. She's the one who can bring the snow and the ice. And
right.
I guess it struck me a little.
Mm-hmm. It's hard. I think both sisters sort of end up getting frozen. So they're both a little bit like Kay. But yeah, I don't know. Like you were saying at the beginning, I can see where they were inspired by the Snow Queen, but it very quickly departs from everything that is in Andersen's story.
Just noticed that. Yeah, well, it struck me as a kind of typical, not very imaginative, modern inversion of every epic story where we have to, and this really, I don't know to what degree this comes from, say, French postmodernism, or to what degree it just comes from other sources. For me, I sort of associate it with the postmodernists, the deconstructionist aspect of that, where we have to turn every story on its head, like Wicked. The new movie version came out recently. Apparently it's quite good, but fundamentally the story is about a character who was evil in the original Frank Oz novels, and now we're going to make the character good, or at least sympathetic. And in Frozen, Elsa, and if we're going to include Anna in there as well, they're not just sympathetic. It's not even attempting to make them sympathetic. They're obviously sympathetic. They appear first off as two loving little children sisters. Mm-hmm. And in Frozen, it's almost like we've gone past trying to make the bad guy a sympathetic character. We're now going to go even further and say the storytelling now has to be about the bad guy realizing that being bad is actually a positive value.
It's okay as long as you're you.
Self-actualization.
Yeah. I mean, there is another sort of bad guy in Frozen. But he's sort of barely in the story.
Who are you referring to here? I'm not picking up.
I think he's a count. And he's so barely in the story. I forget what even the point of him is.
Gotcha.
I think he tried. It's like he's maybe engaged to either Anna or Elsa.
Oh yes, Anna's. Yep.
Yes, and tries to prevent her from going to rescue her sister, if I'm remembering
You're
correctly.
talking about in Frozen. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I guess I want to say in Frozen's defense, it is fundamentally trying to tell a different kind of story about different positive values than what Andersen is trying to do.
Yeah.
It does not stand up well in direct comparison. If you were to say, here's the story, The Snow Queen, and how do you get Frozen from there? I don't think that picture is very pretty. But I do think you can look at Frozen and see positive values like the love of sisters. Anna does kind of go on a journey like Gerda to rescue her sister Elsa, who's gone off to live on her own.
Right.
But everyone in Frozen is very much a protagonist and in kind of in charge of the circumstances they're in. Whereas I think there's something, honestly, I'll call it empowering about the way Andersen's characters are. Kay and Gerda are not in charge of themselves and their surroundings. They're constantly kind of at the whim of the people and things they encounter. And it's kind of beautiful how it all comes together. But I think it speaks fundamentally to a difference in the way Andersen and the writers of Frozen think about the world. That to Andersen, he doesn't think human beings are the final causes and agents of every story.
Right. There's
And I
something
think
else that's acting on them that they have to deal with.
Yep. And honestly, it's not just like the Christian God. There's also like nature and magical elements and sort of forces of human personality and society that are all wrapped up in there. All right. Shall we proceed and drive through the rest of this story?
Yes. Right.
So one thing I want...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
One thing I want to bring up is I mentioned earlier, Kay, after being injured, I'll say, he's only able to parody certain good things. And then I think it's interesting, we run into this motif of the sun and the moon, where the sun is a very positive thing. But the one reference to the moon I thought was interesting when the Snow Queen is actually flying her sleigh at this point. And there's a reference to the moon, which made me think back to the parody thing, where Andersen's almost throwing this at us as the moon kind of belongs with the Snow Queen. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of just a fake, shallow attempt to reflect what the sun is.
Yeah,
but this whole motif of
like the warmth and the life that the sun has.
Yep.
It's
but again, this whole motif, and I think it started with the mirror at the beginning of reflection and bad reflection and reflections that are just meant to be, or maybe not meant to be, but are only capable of being this kind of shallow, lifeless, black and white.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you get that. Thing. I mean, when the sort of Snow Queen is first introduced too, right? She's someone who flies around and leaves ice on the window but it's in the figure of flowers. So it's sort of pretty, like it's ice. It's sort of pretty. It looks like flowers, but it's not real flowers. It's just a figure of them.
Yes. Shout out, by the way, to the snowflake chicken that is pulling the sleigh.
This is hilarious because so we grew up with chickens.
It's got to fly.
I would not say that they're beautiful, but because like Kay's seen the opposite of everything, right? So like ugly things he's seen as beautiful things, and so like I guess the most beautiful bird to Kay and/or Andersen is a big white chicken. Because when Gerda sees them later, she sees them, they're like snakes and porcupines or something.
Right.
Which you can kind of say she's seen the true evil of them. And I guess snakes and porcupines are sort of more evil. But Kay sees them as these big white chickens.
Yeah. One additional motif.
I mean, I have to say, if they do a real close adaptation of the Snow Queen, big white chickens, I think Disney would do a great job with that.
Yes. Yeah, actually. We've got AI now. We can make whatever we want. Somebody go for it. Hailuo. It's already out there. I messed around with a little bit. It actually turns images into short videos based on a description. So One thing I want to bring up that comes up in a few different ways, both positive and negative, is memory. Where very explicitly, as Kay is being taken off by the Snow Queen, he's saying, "Don't forget my sledge." He only remembered it now. Notice being with the Snow Queen is already having an effect on his memories. It was tied to one of the white chickens, which flew along behind them. The Snow Queen kissed Kay again, and then he forgot all about little Gerda, grandmother, and all the others at home. And then, interestingly, the Snow Queen follows this by saying, "Now I mustn't kiss you anymore, or I should kiss you to death." Like, wow, that's
not frightening at all.
Yeah, but also the fact that there's this comparison. The Snow Queen makes it herself right there between memory and life, in a way that the Snow Queen is taking away a part of Kay's life by her presence, and then specifically this kiss that is robbing him of his memories. Did you have any particular thoughts on memory? No,
it is interesting. That connection between memory and life. There's a lot of Alzheimer's research, which is kind of connected to that. But that is a whole nother topic.
Yeah. One thing that came to mind for me as well is Ignatius of Loyola, so founder of the Jesuit order. He's a fiery Spaniard, so don't take this as when he says something is the greatest X, Y, or Z, he doesn't mean that something else isn't also the greatest X, Y, or Z. But one of his quotes is the greatest enemy of the spiritual life is a bad memory. So that came to mind to me as well. And there he's talking about the spiritual life. So I think there's something to be considered there. All right. Do you want to proceed with summary?
Right. So Kay is gone in the Snow Queen's palace. Gerda realizes that he hasn't come home for a while. Nobody's seen him. She asks the boys who he was playing with. They don't know where he went. They tell her, he drove off with someone. So she decides to go looking for him. And she gets out her nicest red shoes, puts them on, and goes off on her adventures to go find Kay.
Red is a big deal in here.
Yes. There's this recurring thing with the red roses that are all around their house. And then she has these red shoes.
Red berries.
She goes down to the river to try and find him, jumps into the river on a little boat, gets carried away, and ends up with this sort of witch woman. But Andersen is clear to point out she's not a bad witch. She just messes with people for fun, basically.
Yeah. I think is... Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I think you see this in her description because it goes back to what you're just talking about with the sun and the moon. She has a big sun hat and it's covered with beautiful painted flowers. And that's sort of a sign of her goodness. Like, she might be a little weird, and she does try to keep Gerda as like a companion in her garden permanently. But she's not either. She's not like the demon in the hobgoblin from the first chapter who's just doing pure evil.
Right. So I think this chapter is important because it's sort of very clearly Gerda's temptation. So the shards and the sort of the apparition of the Snow Queen, and then the injury to the shards, and then the kind of being kidnapped by the Snow Queen, that's Kay's kind of temptation. This to me seems very equivalently Gerda's, even down to the point where this witch woman says to Gerda, "I've long wanted a little girl like you. You will see how well we shall get on together." While she combed her hair, Gerda had forgotten all about Kay, for the old woman was learned in the magic art. So we have basically the same thing happening to Gerda as happened to Kay.
Yeah.
the difference being Gerda snaps out of it.
Yeah.
And
well, and you
it's
even
the
have
sun
the
hat.
same, like, she gets into the river on a boat and she's carried away by the current and can't stop. And very much,
like
and
the
she
sled.
tries to, like, get out of the boat in very much the same way that Kay in the previous chapter tried to get off the sledge. He tries to untie it and get away and he can't. And in the same way, Gerda is trapped by the river and she can't get out, and the sort of nice witch catches her with the big stick and gets her out. Yeah, and I think in you're right, they're both captured, and kind of the only difference is that Gerda is captured by a nicer person than Kay is. And maybe that's what allows her to snap out of it a little bit, is her peril isn't quite as great.
Do we think it says anything about the difference? This is obviously an interest of mine. Just the difference in interests and perspective between men and women. Sort of the way in which Kay was captured and taken off, and the way Gerda is.
Possibly. I don't know. I was thinking, going back to what you were talking about with the industrial age of, Kay is sort of enamored with this mathematical, the sort of beauty of the, you might say the big buildings or the big factories that we now have, which is maybe more of a masculine thing. And Gerda is captured. She's sort of captured in like this big, beautiful nature garden. And in a sense, I think she almost like allows herself to be captured and sort of lulled into a sense of safety. And I'm just going to hole up in this garden and live my life and ignore everything on the outside of it. Because you know what? It's really nice and pretty in here. And I don't have to worry about anything. I don't even notice the seasons changing outside because the garden's so beautiful. And she's sort of, she's helped by, the old witch throws a spell on her, but she does sort of stick her head in the sand a little bit and just pretend that, the industrialization is not happening. She is just going to live on her own and ignore the outside world.
Yeah. Also, the fact that she dreams as any queen on her wedding day during this period, when in fact, obviously, she's quite alone and not a queen, and she doesn't have Kay with her. But it ends up being the old woman realizes that roses are kind of a key to Gerda waking up. In the absence of a rose on the sun hat, the sun again, is actually what Gerda snaps out of it in reaction to. So now the flowers. I think you and I were both very struck by the flowers. Do you have thoughts?
Random. Yes. Well, so the witch realizes that roses are the key thing that's going to snap her out of it. So she hides all the roses, but there's all these other flowers in the garden. And Gerda goes out to talk to them, and basically even though she's sort of bewitched, she's still looking for Kay a little bit. So she's going out and she's talking to the flowers. And
yeah, I thought the fact that the flowers talk and the stories they tell is kind of fascinating. So we have roses talk, tiger lilies talk, convolvulus, snowdrop, hyacinth. I liked the buttercups. I liked the narcissus, and basically
they each sort of like give a fanciful like backstory for themselves that actually kind of matches what the flower looks like.
Or its origin.
Yeah, which is kind of cool. But it's I kind of have a similar reaction to Kay of like she goes flower to flower, kind of, or not Kay, to Gerda, where she goes to all these flowers and she listens, she hears them all out, and then she's like, what was the point of all of that?
what even was that?
I'm asking you guys about Kay, and you're telling me these random stories about India.
Just to give a slice, Kay is talking to the snowdrop, and the snowdrop doesn't. Gerda, And the snowdrop doesn't acknowledge that Kay even is talking to it. It just, boom, starts telling its story. And what said the little snowdrop? Between two trees, a rope with a board is hanging. It is a swing. Two pretty little girls in snowy frocks and green ribbons fluttering on their hats are seated on it. Their brother, who is bigger than they are, stands up behind them. He has his arms round the ropes for support and holds in one hand a little bowl and in the other a clay pipe. He is blowing soap bubbles. As the swing moves, the bubbles fly upward in all their changing colors. The last one still hangs from the pipe swayed by the wind, and the swing goes on. A little black dog runs up. He is almost as light as the bubbles. He stands up on his hind legs and wants to be taken into the swing, but it does not stop. The little dog falls with an angry bark. They jeer at it. The bubble bursts. A swinging plank, a fluttering foam picture. That is my story. What?
Well, okay.
It is kind of an
what's
illustration with
interesting-
words.
What's interesting, I think it's just
He's
like
painting a mood.
it's a description of like a Fragonard or something. But they did actually put this in Frozen. There is a part where like you see Anna on a swing, and I forget if she's being pushed by Elsa or if she's being pushed by someone else. But this little piece they did actually put in the Disney movie, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. I'm sort of curious as to what Andersen thinks he's doing here by painting this illustration with words, this mood. But this is also where I think some later writers who've taken inspiration from Andersen have done similar things.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien will do this sometimes with a character walking into a new place. Tolkien will just pause the narrative and spend a page or two describing the character and mood of the place, sort of setting the reader's imagination to then allow the narrative to continue.
Yeah.
And Andersen's almost doing this like to show off.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of a showy, flowery, literally, of all this description of the flowers. But I think maybe it's a little bit too of, Gerda has sort of lost a little bit of her memory. She's lost a little bit of her purpose of trying to find Kay, and she's going to these flowers and asking them about Kay, and they don't know anything about Kay, and all they're doing is telling their story. And a couple of them kind of repeat that of, this is my story. And I don't know, maybe they're sort of throwing it in Gerda's face a little bit of, why are you asking us about Kay? That's your story. You need to figure that out. Like, we can tell you what our story is of how we got here and what our sort of purpose in life is. But you, Gerda, you need to go find your story, which is tightly bound to Kay's story. You can't keep sort of running around this garden. Shut up. You need to go further your story.
One thing I'd like to point out at the end of this, which again takes me to the kind of the whole type of narrative and time Andersen is living through, is that at the end of the flowers' stories, Gerda reflects on them and she says, she's missing her grandmother, and she says, "But I shall soon go home again and take Kay with me. It is useless for me to ask the flowers about him. They only know their own stories." The fact that she uses the word useless and not worthless, I think, consciously or not, Andersen's making a distinction here, that there's a value in the flowers' stories, but it's not good for anything else. Look, these things are just the flowers having their stories is just a good and beautiful thing. Is it going to advance the plot? Is it going to be good for something else? No, it's not. But this is kind of a contrast between the world that Andersen is portraying as good and the world that Andersen is portraying as kind of cold and lifeless, which is all about useful things, not worthwhile things. So I wonder if Andersen might be intentionally playing up the uselessness of the flowers' stories to kind of draw that contrast.
Interesting.
Just a thought. Let's speed run a little bit more through the prince and princess. So here Tolkien, I think in The Hobbit, steals a little bit. Tolkien has a talking raven in Dale, who helps the quest forward. Here we have a talking crow, but it functions very similarly. Although in this case we have a case of mistaken identity. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it was interesting because so you start learning about this princess who's read all the newspapers in the world and then forgotten them again, and that's how smart she is. And it almost sounds like she's like the Snow Queen, right? She's super smart, she's clever, she's very enamored of herself and how intelligent she is. And she goes to find a prince who's just as intelligent as she is, and succeeds apparently. And Kay, because of sort of the description of this prince, Kay thinks, or Gerda thinks, that it might be Kay.
And she's confident, in fact.
Yeah, she runs into this crow who I don't know if you should trust a crow to identify humans.
Well, the crow also doesn't say it's Kay. The crow says, "Hey, there's this boy," and Gerda says, "Oh yeah, that's definitely Kay."
They just sort of assume there's only one little boy who's running around. So the crow, she runs into this crow. The crow takes her to the castle where the prince and princess live. The crow and the crow's girlfriend, who by the way is also a crow, because birds of a feather flock together.
Wow.
I don't know if that's an Andersen saying. It's probably not an Andersen saying. It's just hilarious that it's in here. But the crow and his girlfriend crow get her into the castle, where she sneaks up to the prince and princess who are sleeping, like grabs the prince by the shoulder, and she's all the way through, she is so sure that this is Kay.
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I sort of wonder, like, if she thinks it's Kay and she's walked into the bedroom where he's sleeping with the princess, like what does she think she's going to do? Like, steal him out of there and be like, sorry princess, he was mine first.
Absolutely.
But yeah, she grabs him by the shoulder and turns him over, and then she goes, "Oh, you're not Kay, sorry."
Yeah, one other thing I want to point out here is a motif that occurs at least twice. Is the palace is portrayed by the crow and then by the narrator of the story as being sort of concentric circles, where the closer you get to the center where the princess is, the more prideful and kind of icy the characters are. And it's like entering through concentric circles of pride. We get the same idea of entering through concentric circles to actually a cold, frozen scape with kind of unmoving characters staged at the center, which I've accused some people of plagiarizing Andersen. Here, I think one could accuse Andersen of plagiarizing Dante. This is Dante's description of hell in the Inferno. Even the cold, the lowest levels of hell for Dante are not the flaming ones. They're cold and frozen and unmoving.
Yeah. Well,
so I just wanted to mention,
closer as you get closer and closer to the middle, you get further and further from the outside and from nature. So yeah, I think it is interesting. Although it is a very beautiful castle. And the prince and princess turned out like not to be. They're very good natured about someone breaking in and waking them up.
One other Tolkien shout out. So this is The Hobbit, where the Raven in Dale helps the party. But there's even the Raven in this story, the Snow Queen, shows Gerda a little back staircase which leads up to the bedroom, and that's how Gerda sneaks in. And the Raven in The Hobbit effectively helps the dwarves and Bilbo find a hidden back door with a little staircase where they can get in to find dragon's treasure. So just have to say that. But one other function I think the prince and princess do is, well, first off, it's another of these kind of worthwhile but useless sort of progressions of the story. But also, it's a way in which it allows people who, hearing this story, are able to identify with Kay or Gerda, to then, what does every little girl and boy want more than to be a prince and princess? And in this story, initially, we have Kay mistaking the prince for, Gerda mistaking the prince for Kay. And then Gerda herself gets to sleep in the prince's bed, and then she is dressed and given a carriage and so forth as a princess. So our characters are effectively made a little prince and princess through this story as well. Can we jump to the robber girl?
Yes, right. So she leaves the castle with the prince and princess, and the crow. The crow also stays behind at the castle, very well fed in the kitchen. And I don't think she gets very far from the castle when she's set upon by robbers, because she's in this big shiny carriage that looks very fancy and rich.
With attendants.
Yeah. And so the robbers kill the attendants. And
just casually, they're attendants.
It's fine. They don't have names, unlike Kay and Gerda. And among the robbers is this robber girl who presumably is around Gerda's age. And it's interesting because she's ultimately a good person, but clearly portrayed as this kind of very, I guess you would say, like, coarse person.
Yeah, exactly.
She has all these animals that she's trapped, and she's kind of cruel to them. I think she smacks her mother a couple times.
She pulls on her mother's beard at one point.
She's not a nice person. But she does end up helping Gerda. Like, Gerda tells her story of how she's looking for Kay, and the girl's like, well, fine. You can stay. I'll only steal some of your stuff, and you can sleep here with me while I hold a knife on you. Yeah.
So I agree. I think the robber girl in some ways is set up. Andersen is very good at, I think, pointing out some of the extraordinary characteristics of children, or at least of being childlike, which is, on the one hand, children can be like this little robber girl. They can be sort of coarse and cruel. But on the other hand, what the robber girl ends up doing, which I think we also see very much in Gerda and to some extent in Kay, is children are able to have this incredible generosity where they just don't hold anything back.
Yeah.
So the robber girl is willing to surrender her prized reindeer whom she likes teasing.
Right. And this they did carry into Frozen. There's a reindeer.
I guess, yeah. So, I mean, Denmark's not that far north. We got to go way further north to above the Arctic Circle.
They need to go to Lapland. So the robber girl lets Gerda have her reindeer, and the reindeer is from near where the Snow Queen is from. So he knows the way. He knows how to get there. So they go off together, and the first person they meet on their way to Lapland is a Finnish woman.
They hit Lapland first.
Oh no! Oh, you're right. Sorry, I skipped a page.
They hit Lapland, and then the Lapland woman sends them on to the Finnish woman.
Right. Okay.
I love the fact that when the Lapland woman needs to send a message to the Finnish woman with them, she writes it on a piece of dried fish. It's like, can you get more Scandinavian?
She doesn't have paper. She writes it on a fish. Well,
she writes it on a fish, and when the Finnish woman reads the fish, she cooks it and eats it.
It's like a Mission Impossible message. Like, memorize the fish and then eat it. It is. It is kind of hilarious. Yeah. So she runs into two women who basically help her and the reindeer. The other funny part about it, which I think, again, this would translate well to Disney, is it the Finnish woman whose house is really warm?
Yep.
And so they go in the house. The reindeer and Gerda go into the house, and it's really, really hot in there. And so she just puts a piece of ice on the reindeer's head to keep him cold. And I don't know, again, it's one of these Andersen things where he has to just give you this little detail of there's a reindeer in the house, and she put a chunk of ice on his head so he wouldn't overheat.
Yes, husky owners, please comment below if you put ice cubes on your doggy's head to keep him comfortable indoors. Do you think the Finnish woman has some kind of magic or special power?
I don't know, because this is where you do get in almost the central part of the story where I think Gerda has gone to sleep, maybe. She's sort of out of the room, and the reindeer and the woman are talking about how to help her. And the woman gives this sort of, I want to say, kind of central thesis about Gerda, where she says, I can't give her the greater power than she already has. Don't you see how great it is? Don't you see how both man and beast have to serve her? She has got on as well as she has on her bare feet. We must not tell her what power she has. It is in her heart, because she is such a sweet, innocent child.
Yeah, I think the woman does have some kind of special magic because she's able to tell the reindeer that Kay is definitely with the Snow Queen. After reading these characters, she had written down on some big folded skin. She also the reindeer seems to think this woman can give Gerda some kind of actual physical power.
Yeah, because he asks her to give her like super strength to take out the Snow Queen.
Exactly. So then the Finnish woman sends Gerda on the reindeer's back. I like how both women tie. Well, and I think the robber girl does this too. They tie Gerda to the back of the reindeer, not confident Gerda's going to make the journey
here.
otherwise. Yeah. So then we get this not anthropomorphization. What anthropos is the Greek word for man? What's the Greek word for animal? I'm going to kick myself later when I look this up, but we could find the word for that. Anyway, as they get close, Gerda on the reindeer, we have this snowflakes turning into knotted snakes, fat little bears with bristling hair, this sort of thing. Gerda says the Lord's Prayer. And then the breath coming out of her mouth in turn turns into bright little angels who both fight with the evil snowflakes and also make Gerda more comfortable. Then we get the concentric ring.
It's so beautifully described. Like, you read it and you can immediately picture the whole scene in your head. Andersen does such a good job of painting the whole scene here.
Yep. So then we get the description of the Snow Queen at the center. We're into the final chapter. And this massive castle, but it's just empty, full of blowing winds and ice. The middle's a frozen lake. This is straight out of Dante.
Yeah. Well, in this, I think they did a fairly decent job of capturing this in Frozen in the movie.
Yeah.
Like Elsa does have this massive empty castle where she sits in the middle of.
Yep. And now we see Kay in here, and he's set about making patterns with pieces of jagged ice. And I think you can't miss the fact that Andersen says Kay's patterns were most ingenious because they were the, quote, ice puzzles of reason. This is a shout out to the French Revolution and to some extent the Enlightenment. I think Andersen is calling out kind of the whole human rationalist endeavor and saying, this doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Let's just stop. We like life. We like things that bloom and burst forth and are uncontrollable, warmth and the sun and nature. That's really where the heart of things is.
Yeah. It's interesting too that he can't, I mean, he sort of thinks they're beautiful, but you get the sense when you're reading it that he can't actually make anything. Like it appears nice to his eye, but he keeps doing it over and over again because it's just not satisfying. Like, he can't get whatever he's looking for. There's still this sense that
there's a fundamental limitedness. Yeah, there's a fundamental limitedness to what Kay is able to make himself, and Andersen is saying that cannot satisfy. Yeah, that can't satisfy us. That doesn't satisfy Kay. Humans cannot be satisfied by the sort of limited things we can create in the end.
Yeah.
And then I love the the climax where Gerda comes back to Kay, and then he gets healed. Do you want to go through that briefly?
Sure. Yeah. So he is, and once again, I just find this odd. The Snow Queen's not even there in her own castle. She's left to go freeze some grapes so that they taste better when you make wine or something. So it's just Kay alone in the castle. And he's basically frozen at this point. Like, he's blue. And I think it's somewhere it says he's sort of stopped even moving. He's just sitting still. And Gerda comes in and finds him, and she's still praying. So there's sort of, you get the sense of there's this sort of little bubble of calm and maybe warmth around her. And she makes it into the castle, and she finally finds Kay and just like runs to him and hugs him, and he has absolutely no reaction because he's like frozen cold. And then she starts crying, and it's the tears that get into his heart and wash the ice out of his heart, and then they wash the sand of the ice out of his eye as well.
Kay bursts into tears then himself, and that clears
Right.
the
It's
glass
Kay's
out of his eye.
tears. Yeah.
So we see that both of them participate in this. I was curious at the beginning of the story about the connection Andersen wanted to make between the heart and the eyes. And I think he gets a little bit more into explaining it here, that there's a way in which tears indicate an outflowing of the heart, which really is not bounded, it's not controlled, it's not intended. But we cry when we are saddest, and we cry when we are happiest. We cry when our heart experiences something that we couldn't plan, and we're not in control of, and that there's something really special about that.
What it is, it's sort of it is that, like, that outward sign of our inner disposition, like of our very strong inner feelings. Of the tears are that outward indication of that. Right, you're right. You can't, when you feel so strongly, you can't stop them. Right, you might be able to not talk or not move, but you can't. If you're moved enough, you can't stop the tears. They're just going to happen.
Yeah.
I think too, maybe, I don't know, maybe this answers the question of what is Kay's failing initially, because the way he sort of gets trapped by the Snow Queen is he's gone upstairs and presumably supposed to be going to bed because he's mostly undressed, and then he stops and looks out the window. So maybe it is sort of that, like, over curiosity that he has that has gotten him into trouble.
I wonder if it also might be a bad memory, or really something that all of us do. Andersen makes a point that after Kay sees the Snow Queen, later on he tells himself it wasn't real. That there might be something wrong there as well. That if he had not allowed himself to say no, that was fake, maybe his actions following would have been different, and would have led him to not.
He would have maybe taken the threat more seriously if he hadn't sort of dismissed it as not real.
Yeah. One final device I really like that Andersen uses is he's very good at a payoff. He doesn't just conclude the story and that's that. He has Kay and Gerda kind of retrace their steps straight back through basically the whole adventure, all the way back to home. So the Finnish woman, the Lapland woman.
Yeah, they go back and find the reindeer who has a lady reindeer who he's found.
Of course. And then, of course, back to grandmother's door, up the stairs, and into her room. Everything was just as they had left it. That's about all I have to say about this story. go read it.
It is.
Or listen
It is
to
very,
it.
very good.
There's something about it. The reason I wanted to talk about this is it's remained captured in my imagination since the time I was a young child. For some reason, I don't know why.
So you want to go off and find the Snow Queen.
Or I want to build a snowman.
You wanted
So,
a pet reindeer.
yeah, it's one of these stories that has held my imagination captured for many years. So I wanted to look at it again, and I think it's going to maybe ferment a little bit here in the next couple months in my memory, and probably I'll have even more thoughts on it afterward.
I think it is interesting. So when you get to the end, one of the it says as they went through the door into the room, they perceived that they were grown up. And then the grandmother quotes from the Bible and says, "Without ye become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." And so the final line is sort of they were grown up and yet they were children at heart.
Yeah.
And so you do get this sense that at the beginning of the story, I don't know, they're sort of 8-9 years old or something, and by the end of the story, 10 years have passed, and now they're young adults essentially. And I don't know, it's sort of an interesting tale of like they sort of get lost in adolescence and then find each other again and realize where they went wrong from their childhood.
Yeah, and I think it's also a reflection, in a good way, of Kay, when he is injured, is unable to be childlike. And at the end, we see once he has been healed, even as now Kay and Gerda are being portrayed as adults, they are both able to be childlike. And that's a good thing. So I don't think that's accidental.
Yeah.
All right. Shall we move to our final segment, to WikiRoulette? Are you ready, Veronica?
Go for it.
So we've had some unfortunate luck of late. So my recommendation is going to be the first page we think we can talk about. We just go with that one. So
stop trying to find a better one, is what you're saying?
Oh, surely it can't get worse than this. All right, so page one.
We've gone to the third one each time.
Not the 1992 Summer Olympics. Sudan at the 1992 Summer Olympics.
I mean, I was not that old.
Correct. I do remember these Olympics.
Really?
It was an interesting period because in 92 and 90, the Summer and Winter Olympics used to occur the same year. And then suddenly we had more Olympics in short cycle because I believe it was in 92 and 94 is when they split them to have them 2 years apart. So I don't know if anybody remembers the Coca-Cola polar bear ads. Look, I'm talking about the page, but the Coca-Cola polar bear ads came around for, if I'm not mistaken, the 1992 Summer Olympics. I remember that vividly.
Really?
Maybe it predated that. Do we want to try another page?
Oh, sure.
Or I do think I can talk a bit about this if we want. Your call, Veronica. I'm
going to make you pick. I feel like you just said we shouldn't do this, but yeah, go to the next page.
Okay. To the Aid of Stonewall Jackson is an American silent film produced by Kalem Company, directed by Sidney Olcott and Jean Gontier in the leading role. Came out in 1911. Running time, 1,005 feet.
There we go. We can talk about a nice Civil War. I mean, this is a very short article.
Do you want to talk about this, or are we jumping to our final option?
I don't want to make the decision to.
Okay, I'm going to make the decision. We're going again. All right, Osaris. Osaris is a personal digital assistant, PDA, featuring the Epoch operating system distributed by Oregon Scientific, released in 1999.
Excellent. Looks like a little Game Boy. Wonder if it's supposed to be named after Osiris, or if it's just.
Powered by AA's, kind of classic. So, precursor to the modern smartphone.
Early
This is,
BlackBerry.
or Palm Pilot.
Yeah.
Before
Oregon Scientific
smartphones.
is they're the people who make the T98 calculators? T94?
That's Texas Instruments.
Oh really? Okay, never mind. It's another state followed by
Yeah, yes, it is that. Oregon Scientific. I thought the name meant something to me, but perhaps not. I feel like it's something I saw their products in like a science product magazine back when I was a kid, and we used to get magazines with all these cool things like microscopes in them.
Oregon Scientific. We can go down the rabbit hole. Yeah,
Right,
they do. They make clocks, home weather stations, public alert monitors, fitness devices, toys, and globes. So yeah, I bet we did see this in like the massive, fat catalogs we used to get. With all
I used to fantasize about having a really nice microscope when I was like
I loved
10
those
years old.
things. Those were like, I mean, they were bigger than the phone book. There's all these home education things that you could get for yourself.
Yeah. The one that comes to mind semi-regularly to me is Oriental Trading.
Yes.
Which was basically in the 1990s, China manufactured junk. And it's because they simply hadn't hit the degree of sophistication they have now. Now they are the world's manufacturing powerhouse.
This was like the first steps of Temu was Oriental Trading Company.
Yeah.
And it was they so many things, and everything came as in lots of 144 pieces.
That I don't remember, but that is kind of wild.
Because it was like 12 by 12. So I mean, you could get it was all these like party favors, like plastic ducks, and just endless things. And I never understood our parents. I mean, they must have bought something from there because we always got the catalog, but like everything was so cheap, and you could get 144 of anything, and I never understood why we couldn't get them.
Because our parents didn't like a lot of cheap, junky plastic toys around the house.
I mean, clearly they knew we shouldn't be. But anyway, we've strayed from Osaris, which was our PDA operating system.
A few things to note about Osaris. ARM is a low power processor that was quickly overtaken by x86 processors, which are what kind of drove the boom of computers starting in the mid 90s through up until about 5 years ago, when we've actually started to go in the direction of ARM again. Although ARM has been prevalent in smartphones for a while now, but we're at the point now where the only thing keeping ARM from actually making more headway is that a lot of really fundamental programs and applications on computers, the architecture of the processor is written into the code. So if you get a computer that runs on ARM, you're simply not going to be able to install Microsoft Word or Adobe Photoshop or stuff like that. So
this is completely random, but I'm interested. So presumably Oregon Scientific is a US-based company.
It was.
In this Wikipedia article, everything is priced in pounds.
Interesting.
Possibly just whoever happened to write this article was British and did not bother to convert to US dollars.
It is noteworthy, I will say, that one of the things that is not widely talked about in terms of the difference between the way things are now in the mid 2020s as opposed to 20 years ago and 40 years ago. We're all familiar with, the internet changed everything. The computer changed everything. Search engines changed everything. Now AI is going to change everything. Nobody talks about the fact that, as far as I can tell, the drive toward better computer performance has led to what I refer to as the miniaturization of manufacturing. The fact that our pursuit of incredibly microscopic construction technologies for computer chips has led us to things like CAD, and people at home can buy a setup where they can print out incredibly precise and almost perfect constructions at a microscopic level. And the fact that this little thing was equivalent to about $900 new, this PDA, $923 when this was released in 1999, compared to the level of miniaturization we've hit today.
Yeah.
I think that's something about the development of modern technology that is less often talked about.
Well, and this
than some of the other things.
This was run on 2 AA batteries. That's to give you an idea of the scale. I mean, this was some cutting edge at the time. Just kind of wild. Like, I wouldn't mind something like this. I mean, it's essentially the size of a cell phone, like a modern cell phone, but
looks kind of fun and cute.
A little fatter.
So one thing that this does have, which I don't understand people who are a generation or two younger than me, who are willing to do everything on their phone, having a keyboard, I can work so much faster with a keyboard than a touchscreen.
Yeah.
And they're two fundamental.
Basically just like a full miniature computer keyboard, which is awesome. I love that on my phone.
I have 10 fingers. I never learned to type, but I can type very fast. And hotkeys. I use hotkeys in everything all the time. Anyway, so somebody needed me to give them a list of products to buy because we were preparing for a winter storm at work recently, and I had to resort to using AI to help me give them a list on my phone, and I audibly grumbled about it to them for making me use my phone to do work for them. But there you go. Touchscreen, but I do the swipe. All right, Veronica, anything else on the Osaris before we call it an evening?
I have nothing. Although I am curious, aside from Osaris, I wonder if because all 3 of those articles were very short. And I wonder if there's a way to specify with WikiRoulette, like we want a certain length of article.
Okay. That is a thought going forward. Audience, you may remain in suspense until our next episode. Goodbye.